Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today, on a very special TLA Totem video, we're going to talk about a tiny leader deck using Omnath, Locus of Mana. Omnath is our legendary creature of choice. This could actually work very well in a commander deck as well. It's 2 and 1 green for a 1/1 creature, but its abilities are that green mana doesn't empty from your mana pool as steps and phases end. And it gets +1/+1 for each green mana in your mana pool. And like with any legendary creature, it's very interesting to build a deck around that, just because of what their abilities are. So today, we're talking about Omnath, Locus of Mana. Start with the deck, talk about what kind of mana it does use. Start with our lands. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 forest cards. Then we have a Dryad Arbor. That starts off our mana base. Now, these are all, with the exception of the Dryad Arbor, these are all lands you can tap immediately as soon as they get into play. The Dryad Arbor takes 1 extra turn because of Summoning Sickness. Then we have 3 lands that you can't technically use unless you have something else. Gia's Cradle, you require a creature. Heart of Yavimaya requires you to sacrifice a forest before it comes into play. And Nykthos requires you to have green mana already in your devotion. So these 3 cards are also part of our mana. So this is actually a 15 land deck. Well, actually, 14 land deck. Because we're playing other types of mana. For example, we're playing Land Grant. Land Grant's ability is that if you have no lands in your hand, you can reveal your hand instead of paying Land Grant's mana cost is normally 1/1 green. Then you can search your library for a forest card and put that card into your hand and shuffle your library. So if you get this in your opening hand, you could use this immediately with no other cards in hand, no other lands, I mean. Your opponent would get to see what you're using, but this is the type of deck that doesn't really care what your opponent gets to see. So Land Grant is an additional part of this strategy. Also, if you get one of these 3 lands that don't tap immediately for mana, you could discard them with Mox Diamond, allowing you to get a second land out on your first turn, or at the very least some green mana. Likewise, on your first turn you might play Utopia Sprawl or Wild Growth. Utopia Sprawl can only be cast on a forest. When it comes to play, you choose a color. Since you're playing Omnath, you'd only be able to choose green, and then it would add that color to your mana pool. If you chose any other color, I believe it would actually choose to add colorless instead. Wild Growth is the same effect, but can be put on any land. Doesn't matter, we mostly have forests, so our choices are pretty straightforward. The reason why these are actually in the deck will come up a little bit later, but it's part of our mana ramp strategy. Then we have 4 elves, starting off with the original Llanowar Elf. Llanowar Elf, of course, you know what it is, an elf druid for 1 green mana, taps for 1 green mana. Fyndhorn Elves from Ice Age, same effect as Llanowar Elf. Elvish Mystic from M14, taps for 1 green mana, same effect as Llanowar Elf. Arbor Elf untaps forests. The untapping of the forest means you get 1 green mana, but in the instance that you have Wild Growth or Utopia Sprawl on that land, you get 2 mana out of that land instead. Likewise, although not the same thing as the mana ramping elf, Quirion Ranger allows you to return a forest you control to your hand to untap target creature. Then you can use this ability only once each turn, but you can use it on your opponent's turn and on your turn, at the cost of losing your land drop. The other nice thing about this is you can use it along with the other mana elves effects to get extra mana, or with any other type of tapping effect to get extra ability out of that creature. So Quirion Ranger works very well in this type of a strategy, especially when you have creatures that tap for more than 1 mana, such as Duraga Treespeaker. In this case, you can actually level up your Duraga Treespeaker and make all of your elves able to tap for 2 green mana, if you wanted to. But these are part of the strategy. So this is based very, very loosely on the original Stompy deck from the late 1990s to early 2000s. In that we have our mana ramp, we have very little lands, a lot of ways to get extra mana out of our lands, and then we have to play cards like Winter Orb. For those of you who don't know what Winter Orb is, consider yourself lucky. It's actually a very, very volatile card. It's a very polarizing effect on many players. It's 2 colorless mana, and players cannot untap more than 1 land during their untap steps, or their untap phases, as this old artwork says. The reason you'd play it is because if your opponent can't untap more than 1 land, but yet they're still tapping to play their spells, it's slowing them down significantly. And in this type of a deck, you're doing better with only 1 land untapped anyway, because your 1 land might be a Gia's Cradle or a Nykthos. And then at the end of your opponent's turn, you can tap all of that mana to pour into Omnath, and Omnath keeps your mana from going away, which allows Omnath to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, since we can only play one Winter Orb in a Tiny Leader deck, we also have cards like Static Orb. Players cannot untap more than 2 permanents during the untap step, in which case you would probably be attacking with Omnath and tapping 1 land to pump him up, and then untapping those 2 permanents, and then using your Quirion Ranger, pulling a forest up to your hand to untap another creature, and then you can play that forest as your land for the turn, meaning you'll get around the only 2 permanents untapping each turn problem. Then you can play something like Tangle Wire, which forces your opponent to tap down extra permanents during their upkeep. Now, Tangle Wire eventually will fade off because it has fading 4. The way it reads is 3 mana to get out, and then fading of 4. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player taps an untapped artifact, creature, or land he or she controls for each fade counter on Tangle Wire. Because of how fading works, this artifact comes into play with 4 fade counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, remove a fade counter from it. If you can't, sacrifice it. So at some point this will have 0 counters on it. But what most people have figured out when playing Tangle Wire is your opponent gets the first effect of it. So with 4 counters, they have to tap down 4 permanents. Then when it comes to your turn, you remove a counter from it. Then you have to tap down 3 permanents. You choose Tangle Wire as one of your permanents that gets tapped, because whether it's tapped or not, your opponent still is affected by it. And then you tap 2 permanents. So they had to tap 4, you only have to tap 2. On their turn, they have to tap 3, you only have to tap 1. Because the Tangle Wire takes up one of those slots. And our final 2 cards, just for the added effect, to slow down your opponent, you have Thorn of Amethyst. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to play. And Sphere of Resistance. All spells cost an additional 1 to play. Both 2 mana casting cost spells. And since your creatures are very easy to get out, we'll get to that in a moment, the creatures aren't going to be relatively unaffected by Thorn of Amethyst or Sphere of Resistance. This type of deck actually is very, very good against like a Shu Yun type of strategy because of all the non-creature prowess attract triggers. I expect to see a lot of decks playing this type of strategy because even if a Shu Yun deck puts in a whole bunch of enchantment or artifact removal, it's not going to be able to make a dent against Omnath. And that's why it's a very competitive type of deck. But Thorn of Amethyst non-creature spells cost 1 more to play. So, let's talk about our creature spells. We've already talked about all of our elves. In fact, we have 6 of these 1 casting cost elves that can get out and start producing more mana. And then we have these 2 creatures. Rogue Elephant from Weatherlight. 1 green mana for a 3/3 creature. When it comes into play, you sacrifice a forest or bury Rogue Elephant, which has been errated. Now you sacrifice the Rogue Elephant. 3/3 for 1 green. You can put this out on your first turn with enough mana already in your hand or with the ability to recover faster, and your opponent has to deal with it. It puts them on a clock. Roughly an 8 or 9 turn clock, depending. Similar to that is Scythe Tiger. 1 green mana for a 3/2, but it has Shroud, which means it can't be the target of anything. It can be the target of spells or abilities, including your own, but also including your opponent's. When it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless you sacrifice a land. Now, because this is the deck where people are going to have very little mana available, being able to just put something out like this for 1 green mana means you're swinging out pretty well. Granted, they can put out a Propaganda or a Ghostly Prison or any number of effects that could slow you down, but you're still going to be able to generate enough mana, either with Omnath or Judas Cradle, just by saving it up and then swinging out, that you'll get a better effect out of this deck. You're going into it with a strategy that you've built around. Your opponent has not. That's what sideboards are for. Also, this takes a fundamental part of the game that you're going to untap and be able to cast everything, and it changes it so that you don't get that untap the way you'd like it to be. So let's talk more about how these cards get out. Similar to Scythe Tiger and the Rogue Elephant, we have Plant Elemental from Portal, of all things. 1/1 green for a 3/4. When it comes into play from your hand, when it comes into play, destroy one of your forests or destroy a plant on all of it. Essentially, you sacrifice a forest or you sacrifice the Plant Elemental. I don't believe these are expensive, but they are very unique, possibly very rare, because that's a great effect. 2 mana for a 3/4 creature in and of itself is really good. Come on, focus. There we go. It's just an interesting card. As soon as I saw it, I fell in love. It's just such a cool creature. So we're getting into our 2 mana cost creatures and what they do. Similarly, you have Talar's Battalion, a 4/3 for 1/1 green, but you can only cast it if you played another green spell this turn. So the way this deck gets around that, you have cards like Land Grant and Wild Growth and Utopia Sprawl. These are green spells that don't cost you anything because you can pay the 1 green to put Wild Growth on a forest that's untapped, tap that forest for 2 mana. You've played a green spell, but you haven't lost any mana that turn. Likewise, you can use Land Grant with no lands in your hand, reveal it, and cast it without paying its mana cost. That counts as a green spell. But you'll have enough mana and enough card drawing that you should be able to get out another green spell when you cast it. Then we start getting into our 2 casting cost creatures with 3 power. Colonian Tusker for 2 green mana, 3/3. Vanilla creature. Swordwise Centaur, 3/2 for 2 green mana. Garruk's Companion, 3/2 for 2 green mana, trample. And lastly, Harvest Worm. When Harvest Worm comes into play, return any basic land card from your graveyard to your hand or bury Harvest Worm. Essentially, you'd have to sacrifice it if you don't have a land in your graveyard. So what puts those lands into your graveyard are either Mox Diamond, Rogue Elephant, Scythe Tiger, or Heart of Yavimaya. See, when it comes to play, you have to sacrifice a forest or bury Heart of Yavimaya, which is why they're in the deck. You have 4 times as likely to get one of these cards than the Harvest Worm, so you're very likely to have a land in your graveyard to pull out with Harvest Worm. Then we have 2 last green creatures that are 3 mana. Leatherback Bailoff, 3 mana for 4/5, and Boon Satyr, 4/2 for 3 with Flash and Bestow. Excellent cards in this type of a deck. Now we're starting to get into our utility cards, and utility sometimes means card draw. In this effect, we have Sylvan Library, very, very powerful card, breaks the color pie by quite a bit, and Miri's Guile, which, although it doesn't break the color pie as much, still is an effect that is unusual in green. Getting these out early means you get to choose if you're going to draw exactly the card you want. There aren't very many ways, though, to shuffle your library around, although you could potentially put in a couple of the fetch lands to help do it, and that is a good strategy. That means I may be updating this deck to add some of my cards to make it a little bit more fantastic. As well as card draw from Auron Viper, 3 mana for a 1/3 creature. You've seen it before from the Miri deck. Nice bit of card draw there. Snake Umbra, also good. Works very well with our trample creatures. You can put it on any number of the things for any number of our creatures to give it totem armor, so you would lose the Snake Umbra instead of the creature. And along the same lines of removal, you can use Beast Within to get rid of your opponent's lands or artifacts or creatures. If they manage to put out the Ghostly Prison or the Propaganda, this is what we would most likely use to take care of it. And yeah, decent card. 3 mana removal is really, really good. Finally, we have Epic Confrontation, which is an excellent card from Dragons of Tarkir. 1/1 green, target creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. It fights target creature you don't control. This can let you take out a Shu Yun if they manage to get out on turn 2 or 3. Epic Confrontation on your own elf, you might not like it, but you could sacrifice your own elf to do it. But on your second turn, you could level up a Duraga Tree Speaker, and then tap it and use its effect to give it +1/+2, turning it into a 2/4, and it would survive against Shu Yun. How fantastic is that? And finally, we get into our creature pumps and counter spells. In this case, our creature pumps are Rancor, all-purpose green creature pump. Aspect of Hydra works very well with our devotion to green, as we're likely to have out a lot of devotion with all these green mana producing spells, or green mana producing lands and artifacts and spells and effects in general. And then, in case somebody were to try and take out Omnath, you could swing out with Omnath and everything else. Whatever they don't block, you could pour all of the mana off of Omnath's ability into an Untamed Might to target whatever would get through. Because Omnath is a battery and kind of can put your opponent on a clock. If you get one of these early and you get Omnath out and just pump him up to 23 mana and just swing out and just put it on whatever needs to get through. But our counterspells are Vines of Vastwood and Ranger's Guile, which doesn't seem like much, but Omnath is the type of card people want to get rid of as quickly as possible. That's why we have our instants. That's why we have our flash creature, but really, we need to protect our creatures as much as possible. That's why Vines of Vastwood and Ranger's Guile are in the deck. Both effectively can give each creature hexproof without losing as much when we cast it Because Omnath, you pay 1 green mana for the +1/+1. On Omnath, it was having the +1/+1 anyway from that green mana. Take off the 2 mana for Vines of Vastwood, and Omnath gets +4/+4. It would essentially only be getting a +2/+2 pump, but it would be protected. That's why it's in the deck. So, Omnath, Locus of Mana. This is the tiny leader deck, although you can build a decent commander deck out of this. Potentially going green-white with Gadak Teagued and playing Thalia, or any manner of cards that get rid of or cost your opponent extra to play their non-creature spells. And just play so many creature effects like Spell Shapers and things like that. So, I hope this deck has inspired you. I hope this has given you potentially an answer to dealing with your opponent's Shugun strategies or whatever you need to do. Some of these cards are kind of expensive. You might want to, like, you could replace the Gia's Cradle and the Mox Diamond and the Tanglewire with any other kind of mana ramp, or even more creatures that could tap for mana or untap effects. Play around with it. Proxy them. Do a search for what it is you're looking for to do exactly. Be very specific on what the creature's abilities are, what the artifact's abilities are, so you know what you're looking for. And yeah, have fun. Have fun with it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you're having a wonderful morning, a wonderful afternoon, and a wonderful evening, and I hope tomorrow's even better. Yeah, so take care, everybody.